Okay. Good afternoon, whosoever, or good evening, or good day, whenever you are, or whosoever is going to be watching this presentation. I decided to record the presentation basically because some of the things that I discuss in this presentation or study can be just needs a little bit more added context, and I didn't want to add 30, 40 slides worth of information. So thought, it's best to keep it, nice and sweet, and show my face and discuss discuss and actually do the presentation myself. As you may be curious, my name is Emmett Allen. One of the students here for the Python programming class. And the title of my presentation is Inflation and Unhappiness. So start off with the introduction. So in the introduction, basically, since the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been economic unrest with the prices of goods and services ever so steadily increasing, right? We see it all over the place. You go to the grocery store, you know, milk is on the rise every year. Energy bills, get your Con Ed, and it's just like another, before it was maybe 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Now it's 6 cents or 7 cents a kilowatt per hour. Gas is another one. Just overall, general increase in the goods and services that we use every day. The steady increase is due to an economic phenomenon known as inflation, which is the upward price movement of goods and services, according to the Department of Labor of the United States. So, this is actually, inflation is actually a normal occurrence within a capitalistic economy, or not even capitalistic, but within any economy, especially in the global economy. Inflation and the upward movement of goods, of the price of goods, is something that is a normal thing, right? What happens though is the rate of inflation, and that is what we're going to be discussing a little bit more later. The presentation is a quantitative analysis between the reported happiness scores of countries globally. 148 countries are included in this presentation, or we're going to do an analysis of 148 countries, right? And their happiness scores in relation to overall inflation factors between 2019 and 2022. So 2019, of course, that's kind of like at the precipice of pre-COVID, of like COVID-19, of the COVID-19 pandemic that happened between what really, set the stage at 2020, March 2020. But going to be using the years for this analysis of 2019 to 2022 to get a full scope of pre-COVID, post-COVID-19 pandemic, and COVID-19 pandemic, and then post-pandemic recovery of the economy. So we have the hypothesis. So the hypothesis basically is want to find out if, as global inflation increases, right, will overall happiness decrease, right? Such that, as prices go up, will we see, or, the prices of services and goods go up? Will we see impact on happiness ratings on certain countries? Right? Honestly, but I believe that, as inflation goes up, there will be an effect of happiness, and it would be a decrease in happiness, right? Because just like, any normal person, the working man, right, or woman, or what have you, right? It gets kind of hard when your dollar isn't working as hard as it used to, right? It's not able to produce as much as it used to, you know. It's like back in my day, in the early 2000s when I was growing up in middle school and stuff like that, we were able to buy, basically a whole, like a snack, a brownie, like some chips, a brownie, and a soda for $1. And nowadays, shoot, the chips alone are $1. So just trying to see, if we can if we can make statistical analysis on a data set that I'm going to introduce soon to see if our hypothesis does hold true. So next is the data set overview. So the data set that I'm going to be using for this presentation for this study is the World Happiness Index and Inflation data set. So it explores the relationship between global economics and well-being. It uses data from the World Happiness Index and compares it with countries' economic indicators, such as GDP, consumer price inflation, food price inflation, and many more. It also compares happiness and social indicators, such as freedom to make choices, generosity, and social support. And as I said before, this data is gathered from 148 countries between the years of 2015 to 2023. So basically, a bunch of researchers, they took the World Happiness Index, which is a data set that is used or that is formulated by it's a Swedish like research group, social good research group, and they compare the data from that study to that of countries and the economics of those countries. So I thought it was a really interesting data set to work on, and just as the hypothesis said, it kind of is trying to use this data set to get some insight into the correlation between happiness and inflation. So I'll continue here. So this is the World Happiness Index and inflation statistics. So this is a general description of the statistics on some of the columns here. The only column that I don't include here is country, year, and continent, because those aren't nominal values. Um, Not really focusing on any particular country, though if you do care to look into the Python notebook, I did start doing some preliminary work on focusing strictly on the USA, the United States, and seeing if there's any impact, if there's anything more clearer, um, that we can find or honing into basically the study on a country basis, using the United States as an example. But that's in the Python notebook. That's not in the presentation. So, as described before, first column is a rank. So each country has a rank based on the score, the happiness score. So the happiness score is a generated score. Basically, these researchers went around and gave surveys to, people of all walks of Earth, right? All walks of life on this Earth and all different countries. And based on that score, you're able to, generate a rank based on how people feel about the happiness score between 1 and 10 that they would give for a certain country. There's also, like I said, there's also economics, as you see here, energy consumer price inflation, food consumer price inflation, a lot of different GDP deflator index growth rate, so GDP growth rate. There's also social supports, health, life expectancy at birth, and so on. So it's really, really nice and varied data set, if I were to say so myself. So I'm going to continue here. So the data set that I'm using has been normalized for missing nominal values by replacing null or non-conforming values with the mean for each column. So basically, there was some instances that the columns for certain data inside the data set, they didn't have values within those certain columns or rows. So to mitigate that, I just took the means for each of the uh, respective columns and then substituted the mean for those values in the data, those cells in the data set um, for the means. So just basically like just normalizing the data. So I don't have any, I don't, I'm not missing a null, not having to deal with any null data or data that is just zero or, it just doesn't make sense. If I have a column with all nominal values and I have a string value, that doesn't quite make sense. That'll cause a bunch of errors. So you can see that within also the Python notebook, the Jupyter notebook. I actually created a data class specifically for this, which was pretty cool. And you could see more of that, as you explore the notebook. So next, the data has also been truncated to focus on the time periods between 2019 and 2022 inclusively, the defining years before and after the COVID-19 pandemic. So this data here, this general data description here is just the values of all the countries and the columns between 2019 and 2022, right? So like said in the beginning of the intro, the pre-COVID, COVID, and post-COVID time periods, right? This study focuses primarily on happiness scores and headline consumer price inflation. And headline consumer price inflation is the amount of inflation in a given economy in relation to all goods and services. So just going back here in the table, you see that there's many different types of inflation here on these columns. So I'm only focusing on the headline consumer price inflation, which is basically the I would say it was kind of like the average inflation that the typical consumer would encounter, for not only for energy and food prices, but for prices for any types of good and services, as opposed to the official core consumer price inflation. The official core consumer price inflation excludes energy and food and I think a few other inflationary services like gas, things that are, maybe more, maybe suggested as more volatile, um, but it wouldn't give me the scope that I would want. So I chose the headline consumer price inflation and the happiness scores. So we continue here. This is the correlation heat map of pre and post COVID-19. So the combinations of all values within 2019 and 2022. So, some notes here. The heat map shows little correlation between inflation metrics and general happiness, and in some cases, a negative correlation. So if we see here, if we go to the headline price correlation, go to score, right? For the headline price correlation, there's like 0.22 and 0.16 and so on. So, interestingly enough, social metrics have a greater impact on overall happiness score than the economic matrix, as seen through the heat map. Obviously, we'll go into further analysis as we go through the presentation. And lastly, looking directly at inflation metrics compared to happiness scores, there is a noticeable negative correlation of around zero point 0.2 or 20%. And feel free to pause here and look at the correlation map values and make your inferences here about whether the hypothesis is true or not. Gonna gonna continue on from here. So next is the exploratory data analysis, right? So first we have a scatter plot map of the happiness score versus consumer price inflation pre-COVID. So this is the inclusion of 2019 and 2020, right? So looking at this scatter plot, the price inflation didn't go over 100, besides a few outliers. And instead, the inflation usually hovers around 20% for most countries. All right, so you could just see it here. So it's around 20%. There are some countries that, of course, that do go over 40 and 60, and there are some outliers that aren't here. I limited the graph here between values of for the header consumer price inflation of 0 to 100. So 0% inflation to 100% inflation. And some countries, a good amount of them, some of them may have zero inflation or very little, maybe under 1% inflation. And some countries have around 15%, 10%, and so on. So, inflation typically hovers between 0 to 20%, with happiness scores condensing between 5 to 7. Right. And you can see that here in the scatter plot that the scores, the majority of the recorded scores are between 5 and 7, and they rarely, if ever, pass 8. I haven't seen a score that has passed 8. So it's usually, for the majority of scores I've seen in the data set, the mean, and you can look back at the mean, is usually around 5, 5 to like 7.8 or something like that. Consumer inflation averaged to 5.8% and 8.57% for 2019 and 2020, respectively. So that's where we get the greater condensation of the scatter points, the data points in the scatter plot. And the happiness scores averaged 5.46 and 5.53 for 2019 and 2020, respectively. So, just like was discussing before, it's kind of like the midsection for all these data points, let's say during the pre-COVID, pre-COVID era were between 5 and 7, and for between 5.8 and 8% for inflation, and 5.4 and 5.5 um, score. And the happiness score is 0 out of 10. So 5.5 is for both 2019, 2020. So now we have the happiness score versus the consumer price inflation post-COVID. So for post-COVID, the price inflation was marginally higher for 2021 and 2022. This is due to economic recovery efforts. A lot of the Western countries had stimulus packages, the US being one, but there was also Canada, UK, Australia, some of the European countries, to name some, that had actually implemented economic um, stimulus packages where they basically printed more money, so that banks and businesses and such and such and actually and people can survive during those times when especially during lockdown. Um, and because of that, there was a higher sense of inflation because we are introducing more money into the economy, more money into the economy. Now, instead of that bagel that used to cost $1 is now going to cost $1.25 because there's more money flowing through the economy. So it's just a natural rise, as said during the introduction of pricing. So going into consumer inflation now, consumer inflation averaged to 6.96% and 13.6% for 2021 and 2022, respectively. Now, now you may wonder again, why so high of a jump between, almost 7% to now almost 14%, between 2021 and 2022. Well, again, the economy isn't something that reacts instantly. It takes a while for the suggested changes, or uh, the economic averaging of prices within any given society. So that's why we had such an increase. And it's also because, again, stimulus packages and loans given out to the government and stuff, and then the printing of money. Next is happiness scores. So happiness scores average to 5.58 and 5.69 for 2021 and 2022, respectively. Now, this one actually intrigued me because, as opposed to pre-COVID, it's not much of a jump. It's only a jump of maybe less than zero point 0.2, right? Between between the pre-COVID era and the post-COVID era, which kind of, made me raise my eyebrows a bit. And I was like, maybe I need to explore a little bit more because currently, it's actually going against my hypothesis, or not even going against, but it's nulling my hypothesis right now because, again, I thought, things are going to be more expensive, people are going to get mad, but it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems that if anything, people got just slightly, it's not significant enough to say that people did get happier, but a point two raise, it's just like, it's just kind of make me thinking about my hypothesis here. So I dug a little bit further, right? So now instead I honed down into 2019. So these are the top 10 and bottom 10 countries with inflation percentages and happiness scores for 2019. So on the left, you have the top 10, and on the right, you have the bottom 10. So, we have Finland, Denmark, Norway. A lot of the European countries or Western countries they are usually average up to the top of the uh, the scores of happiness. So their ranks are pretty high. And we have other countries like Burundi, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Malawi, Rwanda, countries that maybe are facing some type of turmoil or didn't have the, economic packages or are not as economically strong, aka maybe third world countries that were really suffering in 2019. So, to continue with some notes, the top 10 countries pictured left all have low inflation rates, well below the average of 2019. So 5.8% when compared to their happiness scores, right? So we can go back here. We can see that the inflation here, the highest inflation on the top 10 happiness ranking countries is Iceland is the highest with 3%, while having fourth, you know, the top four and being fourth ranked of 144 countries, which is pretty impressive. So in the bottom 10 countries, there's only four countries now that are either near or exceed the average inflation rate. So if we go back here, right, and we said the average inflation rate is 5.8%. So we can go here, we have Zimbabwe, Haiti, Malawi, and South Sudan, right? So out of the bottom 10 countries, really only four countries, so 4 out of 10, exceeded the price inflation rate, the average. And we have two countries here that are outliers within the bottom 10 countries. So the two countries are outliers out of that 0 to 20% threshold that we discussed before for 2019 and 2020 in that scatter plot. So I can just go back here. So in this scatter plot, um, specifically, we have Zimbabwe, right, having the highest inflation rate at 255%. So see Zimbabwe and South Sudan. South Sudan has 51% inflation, but Zimbabwe has a 255% inflation, which is, yes, the highest inflation rate um, for the year 2019. And another strange thing, not strange, but just interesting, right, is that one country, Burundi, had a negative inflation rate and still rated in the bottom 10 for happiness scores. So this kind of, raised my eyebrows a bit, right? How is a country that has a negative inflation still scoring so low on general happiness, right? Again, it's kind of going against my hypothesis or nulling my hypothesis. But we're going to continue with some more analysis here. So the next set of data I looked at is instead of looking in between 2020 and 2021, for this set of analysis, I just stuck to 2019 and 2022 to compare pre-COVID and post-COVID, like post-COVID recovery and pre-COVID-19 pandemic, right? So we saw the pre-COVID-19 pandemic. We saw how the world was, at least in 2019, right? Where COVID-19 was, I would say it didn't have as much of an impact as it did in 2020. In 2019, it was still rarely, it was still not as known. So we have 2020 now, where, the world has gone through the COVID-19 pandemic and is actually 2 years out in the post recovery or post COVID-19 recovery stages. And again, as said before, usually again the Western countries or the Western societies have are usually at the top 10, and the what we would consider third world countries are at the bottom 10, right? With Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Switzerland, the Nordic countries, scoring high in that top 10. And you have, again, we have Jordan, Togo, we have Zambia, Zambia, Maui. We have a good amount. The amounts of countries that are in the bottom 10 usually are in the African continent. All right. So continue here. So, again, similarly to 2019, the top 10 countries in 2022 have inflation rates that are below the global average. We discussed the global average before for 2022, which was 13.60%, 13.6%, right? So 13.6%, you see there is no, the only closest country again is Netherlands. Netherlands always likes teetering that line with inflation. Just like we saw for 2019, same for 2022. They are 2019, I think they were a little higher, and 2022, they are a few percentage points under the average inflation rate. As with 2019, the bottom 10 countries in 2022 have only four countries that exceed the average inflation rate. So we have, again, an average inflation rate of 13.6%. Okay, we have Maui at one, Sierra Leone at two, Zimbabwe at three, and Lebanon at four. Right, so we have four countries there, and the top 10, I mean, in the bottom 10 that overseed that threshold. Denmark, the second highest scoring country, has an inflation rate that is only around a 0.06%. This is rounded. 0.6%, 0.06 difference than its happiness score, right? So when we look at Denmark here, Denmark, again, these Nordic countries are very interesting, where we have 7.69, I'm just going to call it there. I don't have to say out all the numbers, but 7.69 for percentage in consumer price inflation, but a 7.63 in score. Having the score being so close to the inflation percentage is just, for me, it was just something that was just like, wow, like who would have thought? And they are the second highest country for happiness in the world for 2022. So very, very interesting. And Afghanistan now, the lowest scoring country in happiness, had an inflation rate of 10.6%, slightly lower than the global average for that year, right? So this was interesting again too. If we compare Afghanistan and Netherlands, right? Netherlands has a 10% price inflation and Afghanistan has a 10.6% um, inflation. But we can see how varied they are in happiness scores, right? We have Netherlands, they're in the top, they're the top one, two, three, four, five. They're top five in happiness score and ranking, right? For general happiness and well-being and for the people that live in the Netherlands, right? While in Afghanistan, they are 144th place out of 144 countries, right? With only a happiness score of 2.4, which is zero point 0.5 points under their next, I guess the lowest runner up, which is Lebanon at 2.955. Very, very interesting that the inflation rates for these two countries are marginally similar between the Netherlands and Afghanistan, but Afghanistan still is the lowest scoring, the lowest ranking country for happiness scores. Okay, now to get to the results. So results and findings. As we discussed, inflation and happiness do not seem to correlate as well as one would expect, especially during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, right? We would assume, okay, COVID-19 pandemic, things were, lockdown happened, economic crisis, stimulus packages. There's a lot going on between between that whole period, right? Between 2019 and 2022, right? And it doesn't seem like that it's not core the inflation and happiness don't correlate as well as one would think, especially between those years. So countries that are rated high in happiness scores do on average have lower rates of inflation, though this finding isn't indicative for countries that have lower happiness scores. So this was the case with, when just saw a few minutes ago with the Netherlands and Afghanistan in 2022, where they had very similar inflation rates, but their scores, one is in top five and one is the bottom of the bunch. There are other social societal factors that may have a greater impact on a country's happiness, right? Rather than just pure economics, such as civil unrest, war, political corruption, to name a few, and political corruption, to name a few, right? So, look how much civil unrest is in Afghanistan, for instance, right? Where, there's a lot of, women's rights. The women's rights are extremely limited there. They're in, a constant warring state between ally forces and let's say the forces that exist in that region. There's a lot of war that's going on there. There's not a lot of economic prosperity, jobs. It's not like, jobs are really flowing over there. Right. It's not like a job hub. You wouldn't, say, "Hey, honey, I'm gonna go and fly to Afghanistan for this new job." That's really not really the case of for most people. So these are some of the ideas that was going through my head when I was doing another analysis and looking at the results and stuff and thinking about reasons why the scores in the economic inflation my hypothesis wasn't quite as what I thought it would be, right? Um, Lastly, further analysis needs to be done to provide a holistic view of the effects of happiness scores on a global scale, such as taking into account various societal factors and events that may have a greater effect than pure economic factors. Right? We're not only looking at the pure economic factors. Well, for this study, we were looking at pure economic factors, right? Specifically inflation. And it seems as though, inflation doesn't have that much of an effect on happiness scores as one may think. And going back, let's say if we go back a few slides to the heat map, and the heat map does show this to some degree, right? It does show this to some degree that, the inflation rates, they don't correlate so much with each with happiness scores as much as inflation rates affect each other, which makes sense, right? If energy goes up and food goes up, then you would expect overall inflation to go up, and this see if I can do it here, and this here, maybe I should make it purple. Yeah, let's make it purple. This block here, right? And just erase that. Okay, good. All right. But, maybe a more holistic view, like we discussed before. And let me get this and let's do something. Let's do a dark blue, right? But a more holistic view, right? So instead of just looking at the pure economics, right? Maybe we should look at this part of the graph. And then right here, right? Maybe this part of the graph would be more interesting when it comes to understanding what really affects global happiness scores, right? Maybe for us, sometimes we think like, yeah, it sucks that I can't, it sucks that 12 eggs cost $8 now. But at the same time, it's kind of cool that at least I'm able to vote, or at least, I can go home safely. There's no government corruption, or at least my neighbors are generous to me, or at least we expect each other or the people that I interact with. So that may have a greater effect of towards overall happiness than just, pure monetary gain in values. Let me take this off. All right, cool. And this, and I'm gonna go back. All right. And yes, I'm gonna go now to the conclusion. So the conclusion is there was little correlation to support the idea that an increase in inflation has an impact on global happiness scores. So I couldn't really say that there's a negative correlation, right? Actually, this would be considered like the null hypothesis. I accepted the null hypothesis, where there's not enough information that I had to support the claim that an increase in inflation had an impact on global happiness scores between, the COVID-19 years, 2019 to 2022. And lastly, just want to say thank you. If there's any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to email me at my email below right there. And that concludes the session. Here's bibliography. And yeah, that's it. All right. Thank you so much. Let me go here.